All right, now it's time for part 3. This is a trilogy, like Star Wars. There's been a lot of talk about COVID-19, and because we can't test everyone, and we can't get the results back right away, and also the virus is not detectable always. If you test someone right after someone else sneezes on them, the virus might be in their system, but if it hasn't replicated yet, you have to wait a day or two to even detect the virus. So, testing is problematic. You've got to think it through. How many deaths have been caused by COVID-19 that were not tested for and not included? The one thing that we can do is we can say we're now getting at the point where we can look back at this hidden cost. We have data now, and this just came out. I'm really happy with the newspaper that did this. They put out good data about it that we can talk about, and this just came out. But even this data only goes through May 9th. So we're looking back at a little bit of a lag. One of the things you might think about is we have taken care of COVID-19 by doing a lockdown. And that would take care of anything that spreads by a respiratory sort of measure. And so wouldn't that bring down influenza? And so we looked at that, and here in the orange is the most recent influenza season. And look at this. In March, it started to go down more. And it was gone by April, when usually you have about 20,000 or maybe actually about 10,000 cases left in April. So from 10,000 to basically 1,000, it looks like this has brought down the flu by about 90%. Because the flu doesn't really cause that many deaths, this would have saved some lives, but not nearly as many as COVID took during the same time period. When you add it all up, though, you've got to wonder, we're saving lives in some way from other causes. We've also got to worry about psychological and spiritual health. That will take lives too, in a much more indirect way, and it's harder to measure. The one thing that we can measure is we know that a death is a death. Somebody dies, they're going to get reported, and we have mechanisms for reporting that. Those mechanisms are relatively slow, and they move on the stage of months rather than on weeks or days. And so I've been waiting for somebody to do a broad-based study of all 50 states for what are the overall deaths relative to the overall deaths, because deaths happen, right? We've got to be able to look at the data relative to the normal baseline of how many people are dying. So, this is a sad topic and a morbid one, but it's what we were talking about when we were talking about an epidemic. And actually what I've seen in looking at this, it's like many other things. When I look at the data, I see something, I'm worried about the data before I look at it. And I still see things to worry about. I have the word worry in several slides coming up. But I have some good things that I've seen in the data too. And honestly, I feel like we see 2 good things for every 1 bad thing. This is a way to look at things that we haven't seen before. Deaths can be misclassified very easily, but they are unlikely to be missed completely. Misclassification versus missing it completely is a very different thing. And so we have this from, I think this is the Wall Street Journal, not the Washington Post. I didn't copy that. But you can Google search for this exact title, and you can find that, and you can look at the data yourself. This is a really good way to look at the data because it is objective. It's as objective as death. So what has it looked like for the U.S.? Now realize what they have right here is they have all excess deaths in pink, and they shade in the COVID-19 deaths. So it looks, it's pink and shaded. The pure pink is excess deaths beyond the expected line, which is the dotted line. And that's an average. That must be an average for like the last 10 years or something like that. And you see the actual deaths were actually down a little bit, but that's normal going back and forth in January through March. And then all of a sudden they start to go up, and we have more weekly deaths in all the U.S. than we usually have. Notice the peak of this is about 75,000 weekly deaths relative to an expected weekly death count of about 50,000. That means that you had about 50% more deaths in the worst week for the U.S. Okay? So coronavirus on a week-by-week basis, made a significant effect on the U.S. death toll, but it did not double it. Okay, that's an important point to take in mind. It's hard to put data into context. That's why I use graphs. And that's why you always have to be skeptical of individual stories if you're trying to involve them in the whole context. I feel like I have to be really clinical talking about this here. And I do, because I'm a scientist standing back and looking at the data. And I know that each one of these cases, each one of these lines is a tragedy, even at the expected line. So that means we have above expected tragedy. Now I'm trying to put it into context of the other costs that we must incur. Because nothing is without cost, and nothing is without risk. So how do we manage that? By the way, what I did is I told you that, notice that the y-axis does not go to 0 on this graph. We are zooming in. And so it looks like a huge peak. It looks like we have 3 times as many deaths, but we actually have 50% more deaths in the worst case scenario. The true floor of this graph is about right here. I put it in on this so you can see, yes, definitely a significant increase, but not doubled. Okay? We haven't doubled death, and but we are not used to this. This is not right, and we should do what we can to bring that peak number down. So let's look at the Washington State, because I focused on that. And it looks like the U.S. line. It looks like there has been some undercounting in Washington State. The size of the pink tells you the size of the undercounting. But honestly, there's not much pink. It's similar to the U.S. in testing and reporting. So they've attributed COVID-19 deaths to COVID-19 about the same rate as the rest of the country. And you can go back and you can look at all of these graphs and you can say how much pink is there. The more pink, the more undercounting. So the newspaper put these as far as the restrictions that were put on the states legally. And so they have 4 states here, and the thing I want to say is remember the y-axis does not go to 0 on these. So if you're looking at the size of the peaks and the size of the pink, you've got to sort of in your mind say Maryland, okay, that's relative to a 0 death rate there. Michigan there, New Jersey there, New York City there. New York City, the y-axis is pretty much accurate already. Remember what I've said, New York City has always been an order of magnitude different than everywhere else. New York City had multiple times their usual death rate. They had about 8 times their usual death rate at the peak of this was caused by COVID. And this is including the excess deaths, which are factored in. And you see, though, that their excess deaths are roughly proportional. You see all these other ones. The only thing that happens is the curve smooths out because when you have more deaths, you have more numbers that smooth out the curve. This is what normally happens with noisy data. You're farther above the noise. So New York City was hit really hard. And it's important to note, most other places were not like New York City. New Jersey probably had the spillover from New York City and should be considered a single outbreak. Michigan, Maryland, those are definitely significant peaks, but none of them appears to have been even doubled from the normal expected death rate by the addition of COVID deaths. California, and California is weird. There's, and I say they had a lot of excess deaths early. You see a lot of pink on the California that's come down lately. California had problems with testing. And so what this isn't some conspiracy theory to say that California was hiding something. California had trouble testing its people. And they had trouble reporting those tests and putting the tests together with death. And there's been evidence of this, by the way, in how California has reported the data and has reported pending tests. They get a low grade when it comes to places like covidtracking.com that looks at how states report. How you report the tests is an indicator of whether you're having problems with actually testing everyone that you need to. So there's a couple of interesting things here. New York State actually looks like a normal state when you exclude New York City from it. Probably an above normal number of deaths, but not not astronomically higher like New York City itself is. And so the next category that the newspaper did was moderate restrictions. And you see here you have Louisiana, Massachusetts. It looks like Massachusetts is testing well. Louisiana also is testing well. They had an early outbreak, and they appear to have brought it under control. The early outbreak was bad, but there's not a huge amount of underreporting. If I had to say where the underreporting is, it looks like it's in Virginia. So that's where you see more pink. And if you see more pink, you have a higher proportion of excess deaths. Here's all the other moderate states that the newspaper put together. And you see that Hawaii, Idaho, Kansas, Kentucky, and Maine all do not show significant peaks at all. With the thing is, Idaho had a significant peak that was not caught early. You look at that big pink thing in Idaho. But Idaho also has very low numbers overall, and its numbers are more fluctuating up and down. They just colored a fluctuation pink. So I'm not even sure if Idaho is just a fluctuation. It's barely above the error bars for the expected number of deaths. So again, nothing hugely wrong going on in Idaho, nothing hugely out of the normal from the other states. Colorado and Illinois, if you look at these, there are a lot of pink early for both of these states. So Colorado, and I'll put Idaho into that, even with the caveat about fluctuations, and Illinois, when you look at the deaths this way, there was an early peak of unexplained deaths. By the way, to color the Hawaii peaks pink at all, that's clearly within the gray. You can't do that scientifically. So journalists, this is my favorite journalist data that I've seen over the past couple of weeks. But even this I can nitpick on. But that's what peer review is for. And I do it because I love you. Okay. Here's the other moderate states. Let's look at these. The one thing I'll say about this, we've had Washington that we've looked at before. Here's Oregon. Oregon had they had low cases overall. So they actually had some significant undercounting just relative to the proportion of cases that they found. But they found really low numbers of cases. And they actually aren't leaving the error bars from the expected values. Oregon looks like a relatively normal year. All these moderate states, notice that the y-axis, the 0 is somewhere down here. And so these peaks are half more than what you expect for regular amounts of deaths, or less. By the way, because there's 50 states, I might be missing something. That's why I'm showing you, so you can look at your favorite state, or the state that has the people you love in, and you can say to yourself, okay, what's going on with the data? Just be very careful. If it's within the gray bars, that's within expected fluctuations of mortality. Now, the states that imposed minor or no restrictions, or took off those restrictions relatively early, realize that even these categories of restrictions are very fuzzy and they're a spectrum. You know, Georgia actually still has some significant restrictions going on. It's just that when you look at them overall, yeah, they do have less than other states. So where do we see more pink? Arizona and South Carolina are where you see more pink here. Look at Georgia and Alabama. They have some extra pink and a little bit of pink early in Georgia, but nothing out of the gray bars of the expected deaths for those. So it doesn't look like Georgia is hiding deaths. And they've been accused of doing that, but mostly they've been accused because people have prior convictions. And they say, I think the data is going to do this. Okay. Now we've gone back and we've looked at the data. And the data, if it's not doing what you say, you've got to own up to it. Florida is a big deal. There's been a lot of news stories. And the one thing I'll say about those news stories, I don't know all the details, but I do know that they are details. Story is composed of details. And therefore, you have to look at the details and see how they fit in the context. Some people add up Florida to say, I think that a lot of excess deaths have been misclassified in Florida. And that may have happened early on. You see that pink peak around March 1. But after March 1, you do have some excess deaths that were probably caused by COVID-19. But looking at that, I don't see how Florida is any worse than Colorado, a state that also relaxed some restrictions, but you may not have heard about it. We need to remember there's a difference between journalism and science. This is the science, as reported by journalism, to give them credit. If you look up and down, which state troubles you? Which state has a lot of pink? If you look at it right now, it's Mississippi. So that is the state that I would be worried about. Florida looks like it's doing all right. You know, as all right, I mean, we're in the global pandemic. Please don't take me wrong that all right means that this is a good situation. It's a good situation considering the challenges that we're facing. And look how much North Dakota's deaths have dropped. North Dakota is like beyond the gray part for down below. So, yeah, small population states fluctuate more. The other thing is Texas has more pink than I expected. It looks like if you want to say that there might be some underreporting, there might be some underreporting in Texas. All that's to say their deaths above excess are not that high, and they are still, right now they appear to be within the error bars as of May 9, which is when we can get this data for. The last one I want to point out is Wisconsin. You see you have some pink in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's also going up and down, kind of fluctuating even more than other states. And there are some states that do that. I believe Colorado, and actually let me go back and look at that. There's Colorado. Colorado seemed to have some more up and down. They appeared to have a pretty large outbreak, but then it was brought down. Okay? So if we go back and we look at, Tennessee appears to have an early peak that they didn't catch, and they appear to be still having some pink. So we've got to try to bring that down. But I don't see evidence that they are much worse than Utah, for example. So what if we take these numbers, and if we take these excess deaths, and we say these excess deaths have probably all been caused by COVID-19, which we don't really know, but what if we project that back? If we add in the excess deaths, it looks like we are at double the 100,000 milestone. That means that we passed 100,000 deaths and we didn't know it. But that's the nature of viral infection. The other thing about it is if we have this many deaths, remember what I said about the importance of the infection fatality rate. If I think the infection fatality rate is 0.7%, then maybe I can project that back and say, okay, if we've had this many deaths, then what does that say about how many infections we have? Multiply it by, or you divide it by 0.7 or whatever you do mathematically. It's very simple. And it's a little bit too simple, by the way. I'm a little bit worried about projecting like this from that all these deaths might not have been coronavirus deaths. There are other causes of deaths, and like I've said, I'm worried about the psychological and spiritual causes of deaths as well. Maybe some of those excess deaths are actually deaths of despair, as they call them. We've got to consider that possibility. But if we just say it's all COVID, everything above normal is COVID, and we say how many infections we have, we come out to 32 million infections. That's 10% of our population. That's glass half empty, glass half full. Because according to the simple calculation of R naught, the simple calculation of herd immunity from R naught, we should need to get to about 66% of the population infected to get herd immunity. But that's from the simple, straightforward explanation of herd immunity. I have specific scientific arguments that are cited from papers in the literature in the best journals, I mean, it sounds like I'm just saying that. I'm going to prove it to you eventually, but I don't have time right now. But I'm going to show you some evidence why I think R naught, the herd immunity threshold, may be lower than 1 over R naught. It actually may be higher too, but I think there's some specific evidence that we can actually hang our hats on that maybe our immune systems are beginning to handle this. 10% is a pretty significant fraction. It's not a significant fraction of 66%, but at least it's on the board. It's in the ballpark. A lot of assumptions here, back of the envelope calculation. But I want to say, if we should all be mourning that we have 100,000 deaths confirmed. And this should make you mourn a little bit more that there's 200,000 deaths, excess. But at the same time, this is how plagues work. We had the several flus in the past century, since the 1918 flu, that have claimed about 100,000 lives that we know of, for a country that was smaller. So proportionally, this is actually a plague when you look at the way plagues go. It's hard for me to say this, but there are some things that could have gone worse. And the solution right now is to figure out how to get out of this with a minimal cost of life. But that minimal cost has to be assessed over all areas. We know what this virus does now. So let's focus on adding up all the data, on learning the stories for some of the data. But for a global pandemic, we have to look at global data. I've been saying all along, you should never draw conclusions from a one-day spike. And I just saw another example of this. Do not assume that correlation means causation. A scientist that I respect to the moon and back on Twitter quoted this exact story and said correlation equals causation here. You don't know that. Maybe it does, but I'm actually pretty sure that your priors are affecting how you see this story. Because when you look at Wisconsin, they had an uptick. And I believe this was in Wednesday's data. I'm not sure which day. And it's a record number of new coronavirus cases and deaths. This is true, okay? This is not fake news, but it's distorted news. Because you have the data fluctuating. And out of 50 states, you had one fluctuation that was big enough for them to correlate with an event that happened 2 weeks earlier. That's not science. It might be the beginning of science, but by itself, it's not science, it's clickbait. Here's how I look at it. I go to my famous drop-off graph that I talk about, and let's look at Wisconsin. And there, the line, honestly, that line's not good. The line is going up, and it's going up at a rate that is northeast. Remember, northeast is about as bad as it gets. Technically, you could get higher than northeast, but it's practically speaking as bad as it gets. It is not really even going east. I'm hoping that it might be going east soon. So Wisconsin is one of the worst states right now. The event that they were talking about, the Supreme Court struck down some part of the restrictions on them. That was May 9th. And you do see an uptick around May 13th. But we can put this together with the fluctuations in the data for Wisconsin. And at least we can estimate what the fluctuations are. It looks like the curve's going to be going up again. But it's not going up relative to the expected line more than it was already up before. This is not really a spike. This is an increase, and it's a rise. But we really have to look at this month by month. And we will be able to assess all the blame you want when we look back on this. But here in the thick of things, please don't let stories like that worry you. Let them worry me, and I'll put them in my queue and I'll check up on them in a week. We've been hearing a lot of predictions for what's going to happen in 2 weeks. And you've heard my predictions from 2 months ago. And I think that the most important ones have actually gone with what I saw in the science from early on. It's not because I'm really lucky or good at rolling the dice or have some kind of special insight. What I have is I have a feeling for how graphs and data work. And I also, the one thing I have to have is I have to have patience to wait for the data to come in before jumping all over it. So I hope this helps a little bit, because the one reason why I can do this, and so, yeah, I'm not technically qualified to talk about epidemiology because my PhD is in structural immunology. But I am qualified to work with data, and I'm qualified to talk about journalism because I have a degree in journalism. By the way, if somebody says, we all need each other, if somebody says that that person is talking out of their expertise, that often happens. And that's an invitation for you to actually decide not to listen to that person. But epidemiologists speaking on public policy are also outside of their area. We have to translate the solid epidemiology into solid public policy, and those are not the same thing, nor is there a direct line between them. There are lines we can draw, but we have to do an interpretation when we move from science to law. All that's to say, here's the science. And I always show you the science because I want you to look at it yourself. And if you see some pink that I've missed on one of those graphs, or if you come up with a reason why those graphs are not good graphs for how I'm using them, definitely argue with me. That's what science is about. And it's about the graph, it's not about me. But to know where I'm coming from, I do have a degree in public relations. Technically, technical communications, University of Florida, go Gators, okay? And I know how journalists are trained. And I never had a course in J school where I was told how to interpret a graph, or I was told to wait a week before publishing a story about a spike in cases. And so I don't really blame the journalists for not doing this, for not knowing that. But we've got to catch up with it now. Science collects data. Journalism reports anecdotes. And there's a saying in science that the plural of anecdote is not data. You can't add up a bunch of anecdotes and get a graph. You also can't add up a bunch of graphs and get meaning without doing interpretation, for which you need anecdotes. You see how we need each other. But the thing about it is that I see a lot of cases every day of people getting worried by bad headlines and clickbait journalism. I want you to be able to go into the science yourself. Go to that website. Look at the graphs. Think about how the graphs were made. In a global pandemic, we need global graphs as much as the local stories. We need local stories to understand the global graphs. And we also need local graphs because this does play out in different ways in different places. King County, Snohomish County is different from Yakima, even within one state. But at least the states are relatively good proxies for outbreak geography, okay? This is going to play out different outbreak by outbreak, but that's why, to get back to my original topic today, that's why I think that Washington State, King County at least, is ready to move on. We showed that the brakes work. We brought the curves down, and you saw all those state curves. They've gone down. We can't stay here forever, and we can't stay here until we get a vaccine. That takes too long. People are going to start dying from other things. People are already not going to their cancer appointments. People are already not going to the dentist. Forget about haircuts. We can get by with growing our hair out. But there are important things that people need to do. And there's also important things connected to a person's purpose and to, the fact that we're social creatures. Zoom does not cut it for months at a time. We have to step up carefully. We remember the brakes are there. And if we need to slam on the brakes, okay, let's look for that in the important data, which I've argued is hospitalizations, not necessarily cases. Start to get worried about cases, but look at the hospitals to see what's really going on. That's what I recommend going forward. So I hope that we can get to a case where all the states are bringing this down, and all the states are back to the expected numbers, and maybe we can pull that expected deaths down a little bit with science. We're never going to be able to eliminate it. And so we have to move forward. We have to take this step into the darkness of the future, but we trust that there's going to be some light there. We just don't know exactly where it is. And so, as we move forward, I'm praying for us as a nation. We are in some dark times right now. We're in some times of violence and worry and stress, and a lot of prayers going up. Keep the prayers going up. And what I want to say as a Christian, being a Christian is not putting a label, an adjective. Being a Christian is being like Christ. I want to bring it back to a old evangelical phrase, what would Jesus do? And we have the stories. If you're connecting it back to that, I believe that Christ will guide us as we follow him, and we don't have the power to do that by ourselves. we have to lean on the power from outside ourselves and do the things that don't make sense and go against our natural inclinations to fear, to anger, and to worry about the future. Maybe we'll need to lock down again. If we do, God will be with us. Maybe we'll need to step out and to not worry when you see the picture of people in their people on a beach or things like that. We don't really know what the transmission is yet there. We know that it's lower. How much lower? And when does risk happen? We don't ultimately know anything from science. Science always gives us error bars. And sometimes those error bars can be really small. But science always lets us focus on one thing. I'm a little bit worried that we're so focused on coronavirus that all these other things are happening. And we have the case of the example, the police brutality, still going on. People are dying from that. We've got to be able to look at the global picture and interpret things and implement things in our own backyard with our own personal forgiveness, our own personal nonviolence, our own personal trust in God. That's how I interpret it. I would be very curious to know how all my friends interpret it, whatever faith tradition you come from. Because I think that no matter what, we definitely are not sufficient in ourselves to face these times. Okay. I was going to do one without a sermon, and you see I start preaching. So whatever it is, there you go. That is what I have to say for May 30. As we move into June, July, and August, I'm praying that the next 3 months will be better than the last 3. And I'm trusting that whatever happens, we'll be able to get through it with patience and humility. All right. Take care, everyone, and let me know how it's going.